The worst sound in the world is not the battle cry of the enemy, nor the shriek of a man struck by an arrow. It is the sound of absolute, unnatural silence stretching across a sun-scorched plain where 20,000 men should be. Commander Alexios Katakalon stood atop the main watchtower of Akroinon, a desolate, wind-scoured stone fort in the unforgiving heart of Byzantine Anatolia, and felt the silence pressing against his ribs like a lead plate. For 7 long days, intelligence riders had reported the relentless southward march of the Umayyad horde, a force so massive it was less an army and more a demographic shift. They were 20,000 strong, an apocalyptic wave of steel and fury under the green banner of the Caliphate. Alexios, the strategos of this desolate frontier, commanded 5,000 of the finest heavy cavalry the empire could field, the Ironsides. They were sworn to the cross, encased in overlapping scales of blackened iron, and trained to fight like machine cogs in a terrible, glorious engine of war. But 5,000 men, no matter how skilled, against 20,000? It was not a battle, it was a sacrifice. And the enemy, so terrifyingly close, had now vanished into a chilling, absolute void of sound and sight. This silence was the weapon of a master tactician, a general who understood that the true enemy was not the opposing army, but the sanity of the men waiting for the inevitable slaughter. Alexios gripped the parapet, the rough-hewn stone biting into his leather gloves. He was 47, his face a map of the Empire's slow, bloody retreat, etched with the scars of 100 skirmishes. He had seen green recruits panic when they heard a lion's roar in the night. He had seen hardened veterans break when they knew, beyond doubt, that the fight was unwinnable. And this was unwinnable. The orders from the capital were explicit, relayed in panicked, desperate scrolls. Hold. Hold until the defenses of Constantinople could be reinforced, until the emperor could muster a field army. Every hour Akroinon stood was an hour the heart of the empire survived. Their mission wasn't to win, it was to be destroyed slowly, convincingly, and at tremendous cost, thereby saving the millions behind them. "Commander," a voice cut through the atmospheric dread. It belonged to Cassia, a small, severe woman attached to his staff. She wore the unassuming robes of a cipher clerk, but her eyes, perpetually studying the horizon, held the razor-sharp brilliance of the battlefield intellect. Cassia was his most valuable asset, his eyes and ears in the shadow world of espionage, and she was terrified, not of the Arabs, but of miscalculation. "Still nothing, Cassia?" Alexios asked, not turning. "The latest rider, arrived 3 bells ago, swore they were 3 hours south. Their fires were visible. Now, nothing. No smoke, no foragers, no sound of march discipline." She moved to a map table anchored near the parapet, its parchment weighted down by granite pebbles. "This plain," she tapped a finger on a sweeping, empty piece of paper, "offers no cover. They cannot hide 20,000 men. They can only wait." A deep, rolling clang of bronze echoed from the courtyard below, the sound of the bell tower. It signaled the changing of the guard, a mechanical rhythm of normalcy that felt grotesque in the face of impending annihilation. Below, the 5,000 Ironsides were a study in iron discipline. Their unit, modeled after ancient Roman precision and tempered with Christian zealotry, had been the vanguard of the Byzantine defense for decades. Their armor was pristine, their lances oiled, their formations tight even while standing in repose. They were not knights in the Western sense, but a professional standing army of elite heavy shock troops, each man an engine of destruction. But one man, however, seemed to vibrate with a tension that threatened to shatter the serene discipline of the ranks. Brother Elias, captain of the 2nd Company, stood taller than his comrades, his blond hair shorn tight, a fanatic's light burning in his deep-set eyes. He was young, brutally effective, and dangerously zealous. Elias saw the coming battle not as a grim defensive stand, but as a purification, a judgment. "He wants us to attack," Cassia muttered, observing Elias from the parapet. He thinks the silence is a challenge to our faith, that if we sit still it is cowardice. Elias's zeal is a necessary fire, Alexios responded, finally turning. But fire must be controlled. If we move from this ground, we sacrifice the choke point. We lose the only strategic advantage we possess. Akroinon was strategically perfect, a defensible hill fort, commanding the only reliable freshwater supply for 30 miles. An army of 20,000 could not bypass it. They would die of thirst trying. They had to engage, but Maslama, the Arab general, clearly knew this, and he was delaying. The intelligence I sent yesterday, the fragmented cipher, Cassia continued, her voice low. The word manjaniq appeared, repeatedly, and a calculation. They have a new type of siege engine, Alexios, not the old slow catapults, something faster, something capable of throwing massive shot with frightening regularity. Alexios looked down at his fortress walls, thick, built for endurance, but not eternal. How long? If my calculations are correct, and the machine is as effective as the cipher suggests, Cassia swallowed, her composure momentarily cracking. They could achieve a major structural breach in less than 4 days, maybe 3 if they concentrate fire. Not 10 days, Commander, 3 days. We have 3 days to hold the line or the Empire falls. The realization hit Alexios with the force of a stone shot. 3 days, not the 10 the Emperor desperately needed. His mission was impossible, and the timetable for his destruction was brutally fast. The silence was not a pause, but the tightening of the noose. Maslama wasn't waiting for a logistical reason. He was waiting for the perfect psychological moment, after his siege engine was assembled under the veil of the plain's vastness. Send a runner to the 3rd and 4th companies, Alexios ordered, his voice suddenly hard and precise, slicing through the tension. Inform the centurions that the enemy's vanguard is expected by morning. They are to double reinforce the main gate's inner bracing. And Cassia, he looked at her, his eyes clear for the first time in days. I need every remaining fragment of that cipher. I need to know Maslama's ultimate target, his next move, and if there is anything in those messages that speaks of a weakness in his logistics. If we cannot fight 20,000, we must break their 20,000 links of supply. As Cassia hurried down the steps, her task overwhelming, Alexios turned back to the plain. The silence was still there, vast and menacing, but now he understood its language. It was not a sign of retreat, it was the coiled, lethal pause of a snake about to strike. He drew his ancestral sword, the blade reflecting the orange light of the setting sun, and slowly, deliberately, he pressed the cold steel of the pommel, topped with the Byzantine cross, to his forehead. 5,000 against 20,000. The world was about to change, and this desolate fortress would be its hinge. He had 3 days to write a legend or an epitaph.
The chamber known only as the scriptorium was carved deep into the bedrock beneath Akroinon's western wall, a place of quiet sanctuary from the anxiety that hummed in the upper garrison, yet paradoxically, the place where all the anxiety of the war was born. Here, surrounded by scrolls of parchment and wax tablets, sat Cassia. The air was thick with the scent of lamp oil and old ink, and the only sound was the scratching of her quill and the distant, rhythmic clang of the fortress well bucket, a sound that measured the passage of her swiftly diminishing time. Cassia was hunched over the latest intelligence fragment, a scrap of leather-tough camel hide recovered from a downed Umayyad scouting party. It was stained with sand and something darker, something she chose not to identify. The message itself was a brief, dense column of Arabic script encoded with a simple substitution cipher she had painstakingly cataloged over years of border skirmishes. Usually, these fragments detailed supply routes or minor troop movements, nuisances to be tracked. This one felt different. It was too urgent, too formal, bearing a high-level seal. Her fingers were stained violet and black from concentrated ink, and her brow was furrowed in a knot of intellectual strain. The cipher worked by assigning a specific Greek letter to each Arabic consonant and vowel, with a secondary transposition applied based on the day of the week the message was written. If the sender had forgotten to correct the transposition for a Thursday, the whole message became nonsense. She had run through the Tuesday cipher, the Wednesday cipher, and was now meticulously testing the Thursday sequence, her mind a whirling kaleidoscope of symbols and sounds. The major breakthrough came, as it often did, not through brute force, but through language rhythm. The Arab general, Maslama, was known to have a flair for the dramatic, often beginning formal communications with a formulaic praise of the caliph. Cassia had isolated the pattern for the hand of the righteous and found the corresponding 5-letter cluster on her Thursday key. When she applied that key, the meaningless clusters on the camel hide suddenly snapped into the stark clarity of military prose. The full vanguard has achieved the specified rendezvous point. Our numerical superiority is confirmed, exceeding the initial assessment. The Second Army has now been integrated. Total command strength is calculated at 20,000. The objective is no longer diversion, but decisive victory and seizure of the heartland. Cassia stopped translating, the quill frozen above the parchment. Not a raid, decisive victory. Her breath hitched in her throat. The Emperor's command to hold for 10 days felt like a joke played by the gods, a desperate plea based on hopelessly optimistic intelligence. 20,000 men were not scouting, they were invading. Akroinon was the dam, and Constantinople was the sea. Shaking off the initial shock, she pushed deeper into the rest of the text, looking for logistics. That's where the true story lay. She skipped a passage on water discipline and found the next critical block, the repeated, ominous mention of the siege weapon. The apparatus, designated the manjaniq al-kabir, the great trebuchet, has been successfully erected under the screen of the plane's haze. Initial test throws show the mechanism functions at the highest efficiency. The impact on the northern wall is calculated to commence at dawn of the 3rd day. Concentrate all efforts on maintaining the integrity of the apparatus. Its rapid deployment is the key to minimizing the engagement and avoiding extended siege, as the water supply is strained. Praise be to the speed of the great manjaniq. Cassia's blood ran cold. The word manjaniq had appeared in her fragmented warnings, but now the context was everything. A great trebuchet. This was no routine battering ram. This was a sophisticated counterweighted siege weapon capable of launching massive stone projectiles. Projectiles that could shatter the thick, multi-layered stone of Akroinon's defenses in a frighteningly short time frame. 3 days. Not 4, as she had estimated to Alexios on the parapet, but 3. The Arab general Maslama was not waiting for psychological effect alone. He was using the cover of silence to assemble his great weapon. That was why the massive army had vanished. They were laboring in the dust haze of the plains, building the instrument of Akroinon's annihilation. Scrabbling from the low stool, Cassia gathered the cipher key, the original camel hide, and her translated parchment. She burst from the scriptorium and ran, her robes flying up the narrow, twisting steps toward the command tower. She ignored the startled looks of the Ironside sentries, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against the chilling realization of their impossible timeline. She found Alexios in the command chamber, not on the parapet, but studying his own map, a strategic overview of Anatolian roads and passes. He looked up, his expression unreadable, sensing the shift in the air. "Commander," she gasped, leaning on a table, fighting for air. "It is not a raid. It is a full invasion. 20,000 men. And the timeline, sir, is impossible." Alexios did not move, but his gaze sharpened, fixing her with an unnerving intensity. "The cipher. Give me the text." She laid the parchment flat. Alexios scanned the Arabic translation, his eyes lingering on the bold strokes of 20,000 and then settling darkly on manjaniq al-kabir. 3 days, he said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "They plan to breach us in 3 days, and they have a siege engine built for speed, not duration." He struck the table with a gloved fist, the sharp sound echoing in the stone room. "They are gambling. They want to avoid a long siege that bleeds their water supply. They want to shatter us quickly." Cassia nodded, her eyes wide with urgency. Maslama's strategy is clear. He knows we can hold for weeks against starvation, but not against the calculated destruction of our walls. The silence, Commander, was the sound of them raising that siege engine. We have, at best, 60 hours before the first stone hits the northern curtain. Alexios straightened, his shoulders rolling under the weight of his mail. The 10-day order from the Emperor was now a meaningless scrap of paper. He had to decide if he would follow the suicidal command to hold or attempt a desperate counter-strategy. The full scale of the invasion meant the stakes were now astronomical. 60 hours, Alexios repeated, turning toward the door that led to the anxious courtyard. Then we shall use those 60 hours. Cassia, return to your cell. I need you to find every piece of intelligence regarding that engine, its range, its crew size, its weakness. We may not be able to stop 20,000 men, but we can stop one machine. He left Cassia with her fear and her purpose, striding into the light of the setting sun. The silence of the plains still held, vast and deceptively calm. But for Alexios, the noise of the coming impossible battle had already begun. The first casualty of the war was the truth, and Cassia had just delivered the bloody proof.
The arrival of the courier was the first break in the fortress's grim monotony. He was a young man, barely old enough to shave, dressed in the dust-choked tunic of the Imperial post. He stumbled into the Akroinon courtyard just past noon, his horse a lathered wreck, having run itself ragged across the punishing Anatolian steppe. The boy was nearly delirious with exhaustion and terror, having ridden through territory that should have been safely Byzantine, but was now ominously silent, feeling the looming presence of 20,000 men. He was escorted immediately to Alexios, who had retreated to his small command office overlooking the main gate. The office was Spartan, a stone table, 3 chairs, and the eternal maps. Alexios was reviewing the Ironside stores, checking the count of arrows, assessing the remaining grain, and calculating the exact, finite number of times they could afford to deploy the precious, devastating Greek fire. Cassia stood near the window, quietly tracing the likely line of fire for the manjaniq al-kabir. "Commander Katakalon," the courier choked out, dropping to one knee, offering a sealed cylinder of polished bronze. "From the Imperial Palace, by the hand of His Holiness Emperor Leo III himself." Alexios took the cylinder. The imperial seal, the double-headed eagle, was pressed deeply into the wax, a symbol of Constantinople's eternal, demanding power. He broke the seal with the tip of his dagger and unrolled the scroll. The parchment was thin, its script hurried and concise, but the message was heavier than the great stones the trebuchet was preparing to launch. He read the letter once, his expression unmoving, a mask of stone that betrayed none of the seismic shift occurring inside him. He read it a second time, slowly, allowing the emperor's words to settle like ash over his soul. To Alexios Katakalon, strategos of the Anatolikon theme, commander of the Ironsides. The forces of the Caliphate advancing upon Akroinon are far greater than we first feared. This is not a raid for land or plunder. It is the final, decisive thrust to take the city. They seek to break the Anatolian shield and pierce the heart of the empire. Know this, Alexios. The very salvation of the new Rome now rests solely on your 5,000 men. We are mobilizing the remaining thematic forces. We are gathering every soldier, every guard, every ship. But we require time, the minimum critical time necessary for this mobilization and the reinforcement of the coastal fortresses is 10 full days. 10 days, Alexios. Not 9, not 8, 10 days. Your command is non-negotiable. Hold Akroinon for 10 days, regardless of the cost. You are to engage the enemy, absorb their strength, and bleed them dry, buying time for the empire to breathe and prepare the final defense. This fortress is your grave, Alexios, but it will be the tomb of the enemy's ambition. Do this for Christ, for the empire, and for your emperor, Leo III, Emperor of the Romans. Alexios slowly rolled the scroll and placed it on the table. 10 days.
The number stood in stark, brutal contrast to the intelligence Cassia had just provided. 60 hours, 3 days, until the great trebuchet breached the walls. "The Emperor is demanding the impossible," Cassia whispered, having read the raw agony on Alexios' face. "He is ordering a sacrifice based on old, flawed intelligence. He believes we have over a week to play with. We have 3 days, Commander." The dilemma was absolute. Loyalty to the Emperor demanded adherence to the 10-day command, even if it meant a suicidal, glorious last stand and the complete annihilation of his elite Ironsides, a cost the Empire could scarcely bear. But loyalty to the Empire, the true, underlying mission, demanded he use his limited resources to buy the maximum possible time, which meant changing the plan entirely. A doomed 10-day hold would be a waste of life. A clever 3-day resistance that inflicted maximum damage might still save the Empire. Alexios walked to the open window and looked out at his men. Below, Brother Elias was leading a company in a silent drill, their movements sharp, their faces grimly determined. Elias and his kind would welcome the order. They would take 10 days as a license to achieve eternal glory, even if it meant certain death. They saw the end as righteous. Alexios saw it as a tactical failure. "The Emperor's mission is to gain time," Alexios said, his voice finally breaking the silence, low and measured. "His method is flawed. The goal remains. If we are shattered by the trebuchet on the 3rd day, those 7 remaining days of preparation he needed are lost. The Empire falls anyway. I must buy him time, but I must do it by winning a tactical engagement, not by dying slowly on a schedule." "And if you deviate from the 10-day order, sir? If you engage the enemy off script?" Cassia asked, her eyes searching his. The penalty for disobeying a direct imperial command during wartime was immediate execution. Alexios turned, the light from the window catching the deep lines around his eyes. The Emperor requires a fortress held for 10 days. He will receive the impact of a 10-day hold, compressed into 3 days of devastating fighting. I will not waste the lives of 5,000 men by standing here waiting for the stones to fall. He picked up a small polished bronze helmet, a gift from his son years ago, and absently traced the outline of the cross on its brow. "Our 5,000 are not martyrs. They are the hammer and the shield. I will not waste them in a passive defense that guarantees their failure. I will use them to destroy the enemy's will and momentum." He gave the courier a brief, cold instruction to rest and prepare for an immediate return ride before dawn, bearing no written reply, only a verbal assurance of his loyalty. Then Alexios addressed Cassia, his strategos face now fully engaged. "Maslama's plan hinges on the manjaniq al-kabir breaching the north wall. We cannot fight 20,000 men inside the walls. We must dismantle his instrument of siege before it can fire its 100th shot. I need a diversion on the eastern plain that draws away the Arab heavy cavalry, keeping them far from the north gate. And I need a team that can penetrate the enemy lines and sabotage that machine, preferably before the dawn of the 2nd day." He was choosing open defiance of the letter of the law for the sake of the Empire. The 10-day suicide mission had become a 3-day assassination attempt on the enemy's main weapon. "A diversion of what size, Commander? You cannot spare many," Cassia noted, already calculating the terrible risk. "I will give them 1,000 horsemen. I will give them Brother Elias and the 2nd Company," Alexios stated, the decision tearing at him. Elias was the strongest, but also the most volatile. This mission would either make him a legendary commander or send him to a bloody, spectacular doom. "Go now, Cassia. Draft the operational orders. Title the plan, The Counter-Gamble. And pray to God for the soul of Elias, for I am sending him to hell to save us all."
The silence that had haunted the plain for days was shattered not by a sound, but by a vision. It began as a low, brown smudge on the southern horizon, an unnatural shadow against the brilliance of the midday sun. Within the space of an hour, the smudge grew into a colossal, boiling cloud of dust that stretched from east to west. A storm generated not by weather, but by the relentless march of thousands of men and beasts. Then came the sound, a low, resonant drone,
the rhythmic beat of drums and the shuffle of 20,000 sandals and hooves across dry earth. It was the sound of an entire civilization on the move, a deep, inhuman hum that vibrated in the stone walls of Akroinon and, more perilously, in the chests of the men waiting within. Alexios, standing on the watchtower alongside Cassia, watched the manifestation of his fear. The cloud advanced, and beneath it, the Umayyad host spilled out onto the plain like an endless river of dark cloth and gleaming steel. The army was a breathtaking, horrifying spectacle. Their formations were dense and disciplined, heavy armored cavalry flanked by swirling screens of swift, light horse archers, and behind them the massive blocks of infantry, their spears catching the sunlight in glittering, chaotic unison. 20,000. The sheer scale was a physical blow, making the 5,000 Ironsides clustered inside the fortress feel like a handful of pebbles in a vast sea. "They are commanded by Maslama, son of the Caliph," Cassia murmured, adjusting her glass to track a specific banner at the army's center. "He is known for his arrogance, but also for his mastery of logistics. He believes God is on his side, which makes him dangerously overconfident." Through his own spyglass, Alexios fixed on the Arab general. Maslama was clearly visible, a figure of polished confidence in gold-chased armor, seated high on a magnificent charger near the vanguard. He did not move immediately to attack. Instead, he allowed his army to fan out, performing a deliberate, theatrical display of their terrifying numerical superiority. They formed a vast, unbroken crescent around Akroinon, entirely enveloping the fortress and turning the 5,000 defenders into a trapped island. Maslama's intention was clear: crush the Byzantine spirit before the battle even began. The sight worked its dark magic instantly, not on the Ironsides, but on the auxiliary troops, the local infantry and service crews who had been temporarily assigned to the garrison. These men were drawn from the local theme, loyal but without the intense, almost monastic discipline of Alexios's elite corps. A sudden sharp cry of panic erupted from the storage yard near the south wall, followed by a confused rush. "They're breaking," a centurion shouted from below. "The Thessalian auxiliaries are attempting to seize the gate's inner mechanism. They're demanding to ride out and surrender." The danger was immediate and profound. If the auxiliaries opened the gate, even momentarily, the Umayyad host would surge in and sweep the fortress clean. Discipline, Alexios knew, was the only thing standing between them and mass slaughter. In a battle of 5,000 against 20,000, any weakness was fatal. Alexios did not hesitate. He spun on his heel and descended the tower steps at a run, Cassia scrambling to keep up. He burst into the courtyard where a riot of fear was beginning to bloom. A group of auxiliary soldiers, their faces gray with terror, were wrestling with two Ironside guards near the iron grate of the postern gate, shouting desperate pleas to be allowed to escape or parley. Brother Elias, captain of the 2nd Company, arrived at the same moment, his sword already drawn. His zealotry, usually controlled, flared into violent fury. "Traitors! For the love of God, stand down or be judged!" Elias was prepared to wade into the desperate men, bringing the brutal judgment of faith and steel. But Alexios stopped him with a single sharp command. "Hold, Elias. Do not spill Christian blood in panic." Alexios strode directly toward the center of the conflict. He was unarmored, wearing only his simple leather tunic and a commander's cloak, yet his presence was absolute. He gripped the nearest auxiliary soldier, a terrified, thin man named Lukos, by the shoulder and spun him around, forcing the man to face the overwhelming enemy outside the wall, visible through a narrow arrow slit. "You want to surrender, Lukos?" Alexios's voice was dangerously quiet, cutting through the shouts. "You wish to ride out and beg Maslama for mercy? Look at their numbers. Maslama has 20,000 reasons to feel arrogant. Do you think he will take 500 broken, fearful men as prisoners? No, he will not waste the water or the effort. He will kill you all instantly. to save himself the logistics of feeding a useless mouth. He paused, letting the fear in Lucas's eyes reach a peak. Then Alexios acted with shocking, lethal speed. He drew the dagger from his belt and, with the practiced efficiency of a master surgeon, plunged it deep into the auxiliary's heart. Lucas made no sound, merely a sudden, wet gasp before collapsing. The entire courtyard froze. The fighting stopped. The shouts died in the throats of the remaining auxiliaries, replaced by a horrified silence deeper than the plain's earlier calm. Alexios withdrew the bloodied dagger, his movements devoid of emotion. He let the corpse slump to the stone floor. The act was swift, chilling, and utterly necessary. This fortress holds for 10 days, not because the emperor asked, but because I command it. If you attempt to flee, you will die here by my hand quickly, and your life will have bought the city 10 seconds of safety. If you stand and fight, you will die for the glory of Christ, but your death will buy the city 10 days of life. He looked straight at Brother Elias, whose fanaticism had been momentarily eclipsed by the sheer cold pragmatism of his commander. Elias, cleanse this courtyard. Send the auxiliaries back to the water cisterns to guard the supply. Tell them if one drop of water is lost, I will execute the whole company. And then prepare the second company. You ride at sundown. You lead the counter-gamble. The quick, brutal execution had reset the balance. The auxiliaries scattered, their panic replaced by a paralyzing fear of their own commander. The Ironsides, however, looked at Alexios with renewed, terrible respect. They were soldiers of iron, and they understood the unforgiving calculus of command. They knew their leader would sacrifice anyone, including himself, if it served the mission. As the drums of the Umayyad army settled into a camp routine on the plain, Maslama, through his telescope, saw the flurry of activity in the Akroinon courtyard, the sudden confusion, the swift, decisive resolution. He smiled, a thin, cruel curl of the lip. He saw a commander who was terrified and resorting to violence to maintain control. He saw weakness. Maslama was wrong. He had just witnessed the forging of an unbreakable weapon. The 5,000 Ironsides were now unified, their discipline absolute, their commander ruthless. They had accepted the weight of the Empire's doom, and now they were ready to execute the impossible counter-gamble.
The sun rose on the second day of the siege, not with the clean, bright light of dawn, but with a murky, orange-red glare filtered through the dust kicked up by 20,000 men. Maslama, the Arab general, did not waste time. He needed to calculate the exact strength and weakness of the Byzantine defense, and only blood could provide that answer. The attack began with a chilling, orchestrated wave of sound, the war drums of the Umayyad army, beating a slow, steady pulse that grew relentlessly faster, culminating in a deafening, unified roar of the takbir. The sound was immediately followed by a deadly cloud of black, iron-tipped arrows fired from thousands of Arab horse archers known as the Asawira, who wheeled and galloped in vast, intimidating circles, showering the upper defenses of Akroinon. Alexios, encased now in his own darkened scale mail, stood on the northern wall, the very section Cassia had predicted would be the primary target of the great trebuchet. He was flanked by his most trusted centurions, his presence a deliberate, visible anchor of calm amidst the storm of missiles. "Hold the fire line!" Alexios's voice, amplified by the stone ramparts, was sharp and penetrating. "Shields up! Let their fire exhaust itself. Do not waste a single bolt on the cavalry skirmishers. They are merely a screen." The Ironsides reacted with the practiced, almost mechanical discipline of a lifetime's training. They did not return fire. Instead, they raised their tall, convex shields, forming a seamless, overlapping wall of leather and metal over the arrow slits and crenellations.
The air above the fortress whined and shrieked with the sound of thousands of arrows glancing off the stone or thudding harmlessly into the wooden bracing behind the shields. This calculated passivity was the Ironsides' first move, demonstrating their refusal to be provoked into premature exhaustion or wasted ammunition. When the arrow storm finally slackened, Maslama sent in his infantry vanguard, roughly 3,000 light troops, fanatical volunteers known as the Ghazi, whose role was less to breach the walls and more to die testing the range of the Byzantine defenses and identifying weak points. They carried ladders and grappling hooks and rushed toward the main gate and the western walls, their zeal overriding any sense of self-preservation. "Archers, now!" Alexios commanded. A chorus of heavy bowstrings snapped in unison. The Ironsides, sheltered in the high towers, delivered a volley of such disciplined density that it seemed to blot out the sun. The effect was immediate and devastating. The first wave of Arab runners was scythed down before they even reached the dry moat. The Byzantine position on the defensible rocky outcrop gave them a clear, commanding line of fire down the exposed slope, and the professional Ironsides marksmen utilized the terrain perfectly. On the western wall, however, the defense was marred by a terrible flaw: the impetuous zeal of brother Elias. Elias, commanding a critical sector, saw the faltering attack as an insult to the glory of God, a chance not merely to defend, but to smite. Instead of maintaining the controlled, static defense commanded by Alexios, Elias ordered the main portcullis to be raised a few feet and led a small, unauthorized sortie of 10 men out into the killing field to engage the enemy hand to hand. "Let them feel the iron of the true faith," Elias roared, his voice ringing with a conviction that bordered on madness. It was a catastrophic tactical mistake. The small group of Ironsides, though individually superior, was instantly isolated. They hacked through the Ghazi with brutal efficiency, but they drew the immediate attention of the Arab heavy infantry reserves. Elias achieved a spectacular localized victory, cutting down the enemy banner-bearer and driving the immediate assault group back from the wall. But the sortie lasted barely 30 seconds before the sheer weight of the Arab counterattack slammed into them. Alexios, watching the reckless maneuver from the command tower, felt a surge of cold fury. Elias had sacrificed strategic advantage for personal glory. "Sound the recall," Alexios barked into his horn. "Second company, cover their retreat. If that gate is breached, Elias dies by my hand." The Ironsides scrambled back inside under a hail of enemy missiles. Elias, the last one in, managed to kill 2 men pressing against the closing portcullis, but he paid the price for his fervor. As the massive iron grate slammed shut, an Arab spear sliced through his unarmored flank, tearing a long, shallow, but visibly deep wound just beneath his breastplate. He stumbled, leaning heavily against the gate, his teeth clenched against the blinding pain. The Arab attack faltered immediately thereafter. Having tested the walls and suffered heavy losses, Maslama pulled his remaining Ghazi back. The probing attack had achieved its goal. It confirmed that the Byzantine discipline was terrifyingly intact, but it also revealed the precise density of the forces defending the wall, valuable intelligence for the manjaniq crew to calculate trajectory and required shot weight. Within the fortress, the mood was one of strained relief. The first blood had been drawn, and it was mostly Arab blood, but the victory felt hollow. Alexios personally attended to the wounded Elias, who lay bleeding on a cot in the infirmary, refusing to acknowledge the pain. "You won a glorious victory, brother captain," Alexios stated, his tone flat as the desert plain. Elias, pale and sweating, tried to sit up. "They recoiled, commander. They tasted our steel and fled, a necessary lesson in terror." "You wasted 10 brave men and risked a catastrophic breach for a lesson the enemy already knows,"
Alexios countered, his eyes blazing with a dangerous calm. Better to burn in glory than to suffocate slowly in a ditch, waiting for the Emperor's imaginary 10 days, Elias spat, his voice strained. Alexios leaned close, his face inches from Elias's. Maslama did not see God's wrath, Elias. He saw 10 wasted lives and a commander who could be provoked. He saw a wound on your flank and a moment of indiscipline. Your recklessness provided him with more intelligence than any spy could. You are the finest rider and fighter in this fortress, but if you cannot temper your fervor with strategy, you will be the first reason Akroinon falls. He straightened, turning away from the wounded, resentful zealot. He had lost 10 good men in a skirmish that should have cost them nothing but arrows, and his most capable officer was now wounded and burning with defiance. The initial test was over, but the true consequence lay in the widening, dangerous chasm between Alexios's cold pragmatism and Elias's explosive, glorious zeal. Alexios had sent Elias on the counter-gamble to save the fortress, but now, wounded and angry, Elias was a ticking bomb of ambition. The Ironsides had held the first tide, but the price of that small victory felt far too high.
The sun was still low, casting long, deceiving shadows across the plain, when the silent labor of the Umayyad army finally culminated in a gesture of monstrous power. The dust cloud, which had screened their activity for 48 hours, began to settle, revealing the fully assembled shape of Maslama's siege engine. It was located half a mile from the northern wall, at the precise range Cassia had feared, standing like an impossibly tall, skeletal giant in the middle of the Arab camp. This was the manjaniq al-kabir, the great trebuchet. It was far larger than any Byzantine engine Alexios had ever encountered. Its counterweight box, a massive cage filled with tons of rock and soil, held aloft by a towering frame of dark, rough-hewn timber. It was not built for portability or subtlety, but purely for devastating, calculated destruction. The Ironsides watched from the walls in a silence far more profound than the strategic quiet of the previous days. This machine was the physical manifestation of the 20,000 men arrayed against them, a focus point for their doom. It represented Maslama's sophisticated contempt for the traditional slow pace of siege warfare. On the command tower, Alexios stood stone still next to Cassia, who traced lines on a charcoal sketch of the enemy position. They must have labored through the entire night, she breathed, her voice tight with professional dread. The sheer size of that counterweight means the projectile mass will be enormous, perhaps 600 pounds. We designed these walls to withstand repeated impacts from smaller catapults, but this... She didn't finish the sentence. A series of deep, guttural shouts echoed from the Arab camp, the final preparatory commands. 100 men strained on ropes, pulling the massive throwing arm down against the weight of the enormous counterbox. The great arm, built from massive layers of timber, creaked and groaned under the strain, its tip lowering slowly toward the earth to receive the immense, round stone projectile. Then came the silence again, this time a brief, terrible pause filled with anticipation. The release mechanism triggered with a colossal, thunderous crack. The great arm of the trebuchet whipped upward with terrifying, impossible speed. The 600-pound projectile, a rough-cut boulder, was hurled high into the air. It rose far above the heads of the Arab army, a small dark shadow against the morning sun, before beginning its long terminal descent. It struck the northern curtain wall, exactly where Cassia had predicted. The impact was less a crash and more an explosion. The sound was a concussive shockwave that slammed into the fortress like a fist, momentarily deafening the defenders. The air filled with pulverized rock dust and mortar. The wall itself did not immediately crumble, but the outermost layer of stone facing fractured across a 3-meter section. The force of the blow was so immense that men standing 10 meters away on the battlements were thrown from their feet, their helmets clanging on the stone floor. Alexios, steadying himself on the parapet, tasted the bitter dust of his fortress. "The sheer velocity," he muttered, his mind reeling. "It is faster than any engine I have ever encountered." Cassia was already tracking the enemy crew. "They are reloading. Maslama is not using the standard counterweight system. This is a rapid deployment design. He can fire again in 15 minutes, perhaps less." The truth was laid bare with that single terrifying impact. If a conventional trebuchet managed a shot every hour, Alexios might indeed have his 10 days. But a weapon that could hammer the same fracture point every quarter of an hour would turn the wall into rubble well before the dawn of the 3rd day. His deadline of 60 hours was suddenly generous. They had 48, perhaps even less. "The manjaniq is the key," Alexios declared, the decision hardening in his eyes. "We waste no more arrows on skirmishers. Every resource, every man's focus is now dedicated to the counter-gamble. That machine must be destroyed tonight." He left Cassia to organize teams to shore up the damaged section of the wall with timber and sandbags, a futile gesture against the power of the great trebuchet, but a necessary act to maintain morale. Alexios went straight to the fortress infirmary. Brother Elias was still recovering on a cot, his spear wound tightly bandaged. He sat upright, his face flushed with fever and resentment, but the distant rhythmic clang of the trebuchet crew readying their second shot brought a feverish intensity to his gaze. "You felt that, brother captain?" Alexios asked, standing over him, his shadow falling across the cot. "I felt the enemy's blasphemy," Elias gratted out, refusing to meet Alexios's eye. "And I felt your passivity, commander. While that engine is built, we sit." "You sit no longer," Alexios said, his voice clipped and final. "You were right, Elias. We cannot wait. Your reckless, glorious zeal is now required. Tonight, under the cover of the moonless hours, you ride. You will take the best 1,000 horsemen, the riders you broke in under your harsh command, and lead them east. You will feign a full flanking maneuver, draw Maslama's heavy cavalry reserves away from his center, and commit to the fight. You will run them until their horses drop. This is the diversion." Elias looked up, a terrible, hungry light in his eyes, his pain forgotten in the face of action. 1,000 riders against perhaps 10,000 Arab horsemen? It is a suicide mission. "It is a distraction," Alexios corrected. "It is the price we pay for the Emperor's 10 days. While you are bleeding their cavalry dry on the eastern plain, a small sabotage team will slip out and attempt to reach the trebuchet and destroy it. You are the hammer that breaks their shield. You will draw their attention and their might." Elias hesitated, not from fear, but from the insult of being the diversion, the mere distraction. "You send me for glory, commander, only to cover a handful of footmen? I send you because you are the only man in this fortress arrogant enough to make 10,000 men believe that 1,000 riders pose an existential threat. You will fight as if the fate of the empire rests on your spear, because it does. Survive, succeed, and you will have saved the empire not with a martyrdom, but with a victory of cunning and steel." Elias slowly rose, wincing as the wound pulled, but his eyes were now burning with the zeal Alexios both needed and feared. "I will draw them to me, commander. They will forget Akroinon exists, and when I return, it will be with the blood of their finest generals on my hands. Do not let the footmen fail." The second trebuchet shot struck the wall. This time the impact did not surprise them, but its effect was even more dire. A section of the inner wall stone cracked, showering the courtyard below with debris. 47 hours. Alexios watched Elias, the wounded wolf, preparing to ride to war, knowing the true battle was not here, but out on the dark plain, where his reckless commander would either break the enemy or be broken entirely. The clock was ticking down to 0.
The tunnels beneath Akroinon were not the grand, stone-lined passageways of Constantinople's cisterns, but claustrophobic, rough-hewn burrows scraped out of the rock over generations. They smelled of damp earth, stale grain, and the anxiety of enclosed spaces. Cassia, armed with only a sputtering oil lamp and her fierce intellect, moved through them. Her mission was officially to inspect for Arab sappers or tunneling attempts, a routine check, but her true focus was the unsettling, terrifying efficiency of Maslama's siege. The great trebuchet had already fired 4 more shots since Alexios had confronted Elias, each one finding the same precise structural weakness in the northern wall. The damage was compounding rapidly. Maslama knew where to hit, and he knew they only had 60 hours to react. That level of pinpoint accuracy, coupled with the speed of the attack, suggested intelligence far superior to what a standard reconnaissance team could provide. Cassia was a cipher clerk, accustomed to finding the hidden message in the noise. And here, in the subterranean silence, the silence itself felt like a scream. She started in the primary supply tunnel, which led from the main grain silos to the armory. The tunnels were vital for moving men and supplies unseen during the assault, but they were also a major vulnerability. She ran her hands along the rock walls, checking the packed earth floor for the distinctive signs of outside digging. Nothing. The walls were firm, the airflow steady and uncontaminated. In the armory bunker, a small, humid room packed with racks of lances and crates of arrows, she paused. Her lamplight danced over the polished steel. This was the fortress's nerve center of lethal power. And Cassia noticed a detail that a centurion, concerned only with inventory, would never have seen. On a crate containing the precious volatile components for Greek fire, the very reserves Alexios had budgeted for a desperate last stand, there was a faint, almost invisible smudge of dry, reddish-brown sand. It was not the pale, local rock dust of Akroinon. It was a fine-grained desert sand, consistent with the geological composition of the plains outside, and distinct from the coarse, gray dust that perpetually coated the fortress interior. Cassia ran a finger over the smudge. It was old, probably brought in on someone's boots, or perhaps a satchel. But the placement was wrong. The crate was sealed, and the iron sides were meticulous about keeping the explosive fire components clean and untouched. Only the highest-ranking officers or the chief engineer had cause to come into contact with it. She moved on to the water cistern, the single most critical asset of the fortress. It was located in the deepest recess of the rock, its entrance guarded by 2 iron sides. She spoke the complex, multi-word password and was allowed through the heavy, bolted door. The air inside was cool and heavy with moisture. The water level was thankfully stable, but again, a slight irregularity caught her eye. Along the narrow stone ledge that ran beside the lip of the vast dark pool, there was a series of 4 small, fresh scratch marks. They were not deep, but looked recently gouged into the stone. They were too regular to be natural wear. She knelt, holding her lamp low. These marks were exactly the width of a small wooden dowel or a stylus, the kind used for measuring and sketching. A dizzying realization struck her. The marks were a surveyor's measurements. Someone had recently, and carefully, been calculating the circumference and, crucially, the internal bracing points of the cistern. Why? If Maslama were planning to attack the cistern from the outside, he would need to know the depth of the rock wall. But if he already knew the wall thickness from inside information, The only measurements he would need were the internal dimensions to gauge the maximum quantity of water available and how long the defenders could last before thirst broke them. The truth was now undeniable. The precision of the trebuchet strikes, aimed exactly at the weakest point of the northern wall, was not a lucky guess. The sand near the Greek fire stores and the calculation marks near the cistern meant that someone within the command structure had been systematically documenting Akroinon's most critical vulnerabilities and relaying that intelligence to Maslama. The fortress was not being breached from the outside, it was being betrayed from the inside. Cassia stood up, her heart hammering against her ribs, the warmth of the lamp suddenly feeling cold. The betrayer had access to the Greek fire stores, the cistern, and the military plans. That ruled out the terrified auxiliaries or a disgruntled common soldier. It had to be someone senior, someone trusted, someone close to Alexios. She quickly exited the cistern, offering a clipped salute to the guards who looked curiously at her pale, intense face. She needed to tell Alexios, but she had to be cautious. The traitor was listening. The traitor was breathing the same air as them. As she made her way back up towards the light, the rhythmic, heavy clang of the great trebuchet reloading echoed down the stone passage, accompanied by the dull roar of the shot impacting the northern wall above. It sounded less like an external attack, and more like the grim, precise counting of a high-level accountant tallying the days until Akroinon's inevitable, premeditated bankruptcy. Cassia clutched her lamp. The real threat was not the 20,000 men outside, but the single man who now knows Elias is riding out tonight, who knows the sabotage team will be vulnerable, and who can relay the entire counter-gamble plan to Maslama before sundown. She had to identify the traitor before the second company rode to their planned slaughter.
The sun set, turning the sky over the Anatolian plain into a bruised, ominous purple. The night promised to be moonless, the perfect veil for Elias's desperate counter-gamble, but also the ideal cover for Maslama's brutality. The Arab general, sensing the defenders' morale wavering after the day's battering by the great trebuchet, launched a massive, coordinated night assault just after midnight. It was not a testing skirmish this time, but a full-scale attempt to overwhelm the perimeter. Arab forces surged forward, guided by torchlight and the relentless pounding of drums, concentrating their assault on the already weakened northern wall and, ominously, the main western gate. The gate, which was the target of Elias's impending exit, was suddenly besieged by 10,000 men, far more than necessary for a standard breaching attempt. They knew the point of egress, Alexios roared from the command tower, the realization striking him with the force of a hammer blow. They're anticipating our maneuver. The traitor revealed the counter-gamble. Below, the Ironsides fought with ferocity born of desperation. The assault was a human wave, relentless and crushing. Ladders slammed against the stone. Grappling hooks snagged on the crenellations, and the air was filled with the terrible sounds of steel against scale mail. For hours, the Byzantine defenders held the line, but the sheer weight of the Arab numbers began to tell. At the western gate, the sheer pressure of bodies was threatening to collapse the outer wooden bracing. Arab sappers, protected by a dense shield wall, managed to place heavy incendiary charges against the timber. A column of thick, oily black smoke began to rise, signaling the immediate danger of fire spreading into the inner courtyard. If the gate burned and failed, the fortress would fall instantly. "The gate is failing! Fire in the brace!" yelled the centurion in charge of the gate defense. Alexios knew he had to act, and fast. The gate must hold for Elias's sally at dawn. He had budgeted his reserves of Greek fire, the Byzantine Empire's secret weapon, a volatile,
terrifying compound that ignited on contact with water and could not be extinguished. But the situation demanded a terrible choice. "Send a runner to the South Tower," Alexios commanded, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Tell the firemaster to deploy the dragon. Western gate only. Concentrate the blast. Use no more than a third of the remaining reserves." The firemaster, a grim, leather-faced veteran, understood the gravity of the order. To use the Greek fire now was to mortgage their future, but to lose the gate was to lose everything. In the South Tower, the specialized brass siphon, the Dragon's Mouth, was primed. A terrifying hissing sound preceded the release. Then a thick, blazing stream of liquid fire erupted from the tower opening, arcing over the walls and slamming directly into the dense mass of Arab sappers and the burning gate bracing. The effect was instantaneous and apocalyptic. The western gate became a searing inferno. Men screamed, not with the standard cry of pain, but with the terrifying shriek of absolute, unincomprehensible horror. The Greek fire clung to the wood, the shields, and the flesh, burning with an intense, chemical rage that turned the black of night into a brilliant, deadly orange. The Arab assault faltered immediately. No number of men, however fanatical, could advance into that unquenchable, terrifying weapon. The concentrated flame not only annihilated the sappers and their siege gear, but also created an impenetrable wall of fire that deterred the reinforcing waves of infantry. Maslama, watching from the distance, saw the sudden, massive expenditure of the Byzantines' most secret weapon. His face, illuminated by the monstrous orange glow, hardened with cold satisfaction. The fire had sealed the gate, but it had also confirmed the traitor's intelligence. "They have used the oil," Maslama stated to his commanders. "The informant stated they had only 3 full charges left for strategic defense. They have just spent one. They are desperate, and their reserves are now critically low. The counter-gamble is still on." Inside Akroinon, the fire slowly began to consume itself, leaving behind a smoking, melted ruin of Arab equipment and a thick, choking stench. The night assault was repelled, the gate saved, but at a catastrophic cost. Alexios, his face slick with sweat and grime, stood over the firemaster as the siphon was depressurized. "How much remains?" Alexios commanded, his voice tight with controlled fury. 2 charges, Commander," the firemaster reported, his voice heavy. "Enough for 1 perimeter defense and 1 final localized blast. We cannot afford another expenditure." Cassia appeared, her face pale, the orange light reflecting in her terrified eyes. She held a small, charred scrap of fabric she had retrieved from the burning gate area, a detail she hoped to use in her investigation. "They knew, Alexios," she said, her voice shaking. "They knew where to strike and when. They hit the western gate precisely when Elias's departure was planned, forcing you to use the Greek fire reserves. This was not just an assault, it was a probe to confirm the traitor's information on our most strategic resource." Alexios wiped a streak of grime from his cheek. "And now we have 2 problems, the treason and the loss of a third of our fire. The traitor has access to our deployment figures. That eliminates the lower ranks entirely. Who has access to the exact quantity of Greek fire reserves, Cassia? Not the engineer, but the records." Cassia's gaze flickered across the command office door where the senior staff were gathering, shaken but relieved. "Only the chief centurion of logistics, the quartermaster, and the imperial scribe, who handles the confidential inventory reports for Constantinople." The mention of the imperial scribe, a seemingly harmless, scholarly man named Theophanes, hit Alexios hard. Theophanes had been with the garrison for 15 years, a trusted, unobtrusive fixture. The thought was nauseating. The sabotage team leaves in 3 hours before dawn. Elias and his cavalry leave at the precise moment of dawn. If the traitor alerts Maslama to the timing, both forces will be annihilated. Alexios, we must find the traitor now, Cassia urged. But we must do it quietly. If we raise the alarm, the man may bolt, or worse, execute a final act of sabotage. Alexios looked towards the east, where a faint, silver-blue edge was just beginning to touch the horizon. Elias was already preparing to ride. The clock was at its final, terrible setting. He had gambled a third of his fire to save the gate for the counter-gamble, but the information that had driven the attack was still walking free inside his walls. Find the proof, Cassia, before the sun clears the plains. I need a name, not just a suspicion. For the sake of Elias, who rides to his potential death in 3 hours, find the betrayer.
The 2 hours before dawn were the darkest and coldest of the siege. The massive, smoking ruin of the western gate, still radiating residual heat from the Greek fire, served as a stark monument to the knight's narrow escape and the undeniable presence of treason. While Alexios oversaw the final preparations for Elias's mounted company, Cassia worked in the scriptorium, her oil lamp burning low, casting frantic shadows over her evidence. Her investigation hinged on 3 disparate facts: the distinctive desert sand found near the Greek fire stores, Chapter 7, the precise measurements marked inside the cistern, Chapter 7, and the catastrophic timing of the night assault, Chapter 8. The traitor was not a simple mercenary. He was a meticulous record-keeper, deeply trusted, and privy to the fortress's most vital logistical secrets. Cassia focused on the imperial scribe, Theophanes. A man of quiet routine, he had served the garrison longer than Alexios himself. He was the only one, besides the commander, who drafted the monthly confidential inventory reports for Constantinople, reports that included the precise quantity and strategic deployment schedule of the Greek fire reserves. The chief centurion and the quartermaster had access to the stock, but Theophanes had access to the plan. She produced the charred scrap of fabric she had found near the burnt gate bracing. It wasn't cloth, but a piece of high-quality, oil-cured leather, stained with violet ink. The color instantly set off an alarm in her mind. The Ironsides used black or iron gall ink, but imperial scribes, particularly those dealing with sensitive official documents, often used a rare, expensive Tyrian purple ink to denote imperial authority on key seals and mandates. Theophanes was the only man in the fortress who regularly handled the pigment. The suspicion, already strong, sharpened into certainty. Theophanes had been near the gate at some point, perhaps dropping a message or simply surveying the defenses one last time before the planned breach. The sand on the Greek fire crate and the measurement scratches in the cistern were the scribe's tradecraft. The violet-stained leather was his signature. Before Cassia could secure the evidence and find Alexios, a commotion erupted from the outer armory bunker. Shouts of rage, the sickening thwack of a fist on bone, and the unmistakable sound of steel being drawn. Cassia raced toward the noise. She found the chief centurion of logistics, a large, bewildered man named Deimos, pinned against a wall, his neck exposed to the flickering blade of Brother Elias's sword. Elias, feverish and half-dressed, his bandaged wound throbbing, was shaking with murderous suspicion.
"Lies! Traitor! You starved the horses this morning, Deimos. You have been hoarding the dried figs and denying the company the necessary grain. You want my cavalry to fail on the plain. You work for Maslama."
Deimos, terrified, sputtered. "I swear by the cross, Captain, the grain has been strictly allocated by the commander. We cannot exceed the 5-day ration." Elias's zealotry, combined with the pain and the stress of the impending ride, had curdled into paranoia. He was looking for a spectacular target, an immediate answer to the treason that was poisoning the air. And Deimos, the logistics chief, was a convenient scapegoat. "Silence. I saw you near the western wall last night. You were calculating. You are the serpent in the woodpile." Elias raised the sword for the fatal blow. "Elias, stop!" Alexios' voice, sharp and authoritative, cut through the din. He strode quickly into the bunker, his hand resting lightly on the pommel of his own sword. Elias froze, his blade inches from Deimos' throat. His eyes, burning with fever and righteousness, finally met Alexios' cold, unwavering gaze. "He is treason, Commander. He is undermining the supply lines. He is preventing my company from riding at full strength." "Your company is riding at full strength because I ordered it, Captain. The rations are controlled. Deimos follows my orders. Your wound has clouded your judgment. Stand down now." The silence in the bunker was palpable, broken only by Deimos' ragged breathing. Elias held the tension for a terrible second, a moment where the loyalty of the zealous captain could break either to the righteous murder he craved or the iron discipline he was sworn to. Finally, with a visible, painful effort, Elias lowered his sword. "He lives only by your command, Commander," he whispered, sheathing the weapon and spitting on the ground near Deimos' feet. He looked at Alexios with a bitter resentment that held the promise of future defiance. "But if our venture fails because of a lack of strength, the sin is on your head." Alexios merely nodded. "Prepare your company, Elias. We ride in less than an hour." He waited until Elias had stalked away, radiating resentment and adrenaline. He then turned to Deimos. "You are forgiven, Centurion. The stress is high. Now, go secure the armory. Do not speak of this." As Deimos stumbled away, grateful for his life, Cassia stepped forward from the shadows, her face grim. She had watched the whole terrible scene play out, realizing how close the fortress had come to collapsing into self-immolation. "He almost killed the wrong man, Alexios," she said, her voice shaking slightly. She presented the violet-stained leather scrap and placed it next to a sealed wax tablet that bore the imprint of the imperial scribe's ring, a tiny, personalized carving of a bird in flight. Alexios was the Villate? Alexios looked down at the proof, a scholarly signature confirming military betrayal. Theophanes, the man who had shared his simple evening wine and quiet companionship for 15 years. "He knows Elias is riding at dawn," Alexios said, his voice flat. "He knows the precise timing. He must be relaying the final instruction now." He felt the cold, hard press of reality. The counter-gamble was compromised before it even began. Elias was about to ride his 1,000 Ironsides into an ambush Maslama was already preparing. The spy had to be neutralized, immediately and finally. "Where is he, Cassia?" Alexios demanded, the mask of command slipping, revealing the brutal, cold necessity beneath. "Where does Theophanes sleep?"
The air hung still and cold as the first sliver of the Anatolian sun broke the horizon, painting the vast, silent plain in hues of metallic blue and dangerous gold. Inside Akroinon, the western gate, still scarred and smoking from the Greek fire, shuddered open, groaning on its charred hinges. Brother Elias, captain of the 2nd Company, sat his magnificent warhorse, Ares, at the head of 1,000 Ironside heavy cavalry. They were the spear-tip of the Byzantine army,
men armored in scale and ringmail, armed with heavy lances and short curved swords, trained to ride and fight as one unified, irresistible thunderbolt. Elias's face, pale from his wound and the lack of sleep, was set in a mask of rigid, zealous determination. He carried the weight of the entire defense, knowing that his mission was not to win, but to be a brilliant, bloody distraction. Alexios stood beside the gate, his hand raised in final salute. He had spent the last agonizing hour ensuring that Theophanes, the traitorous imperial scribe, was securely locked in the deepest, most remote cell of the scriptorium, alive but unable to send the final critical message that would have detailed Elias's exact route and timing. The spy was neutralized for now, but Alexios could not shake the chilling certainty that the traitor's earlier general intelligence, the fact that a flanking maneuver was coming, had already reached Maslama. "Ride with speed and discipline, Elias," Alexios commanded, his voice barely audible over the clatter of 1,000 horses shifting their weight. "Draw them east. Draw every horseman Maslama has to offer. Do not engage until you have separated them from the main body by at least 5 miles. Elias did not offer a salute, only a rigid, dark stare. "I will bring them, Commander. Pray that your quiet little sabotage team does not fail in the dark, or my sacrifice will have been for naught." Without waiting for a reply, he spurred Ares. The 1,000 Ironsides thundered out of the fortress. They rode in a tight, massive wedge formation, their polished armor momentarily catching the rising sun, turning them into a fleeting, dazzling vision of doom as they galloped toward the eastern rim of the plain. The ground trembled beneath their hooves, their sound almost instantly swallowed by the immensity of the open space. Alexios watched until the last horse vanished into the rising dust. His heart was heavy. He had sacrificed his most capable commander and half of his remaining fighting force on a desperate gamble born of flawed time estimates and internal betrayal. He knew, with dreadful certainty, that most of those men would not return. On the main watchtower, Cassia, who had overseen the stealthy departure of the 6-man sabotage team moments earlier, gripped the parapet. She was scanning the immense crescent-shaped Arab encampment far to the south. "Look, Alexios," she whispered, pointing. "Maslama is not surprised." The Arab camp, which had been sluggish in the early dawn, suddenly erupted into furious motion. Maslama had clearly received advance warning that a major Byzantine force would attempt flanking maneuver. Instead of sending a token force to investigate, he was committing a devastating portion of his mounted reserves. 2 vast bodies of Umayyad cavalry, each numbering at least 5,000 riders, broke formation from the main camp. One moved to secure the western perimeter of the fortress, hedging against a feigned retreat. The other, the truly terrifying force, thundered off toward the east, directly into the path of Elias. 10,000 riders, Alexios stated, the number cold and heavy on his tongue. Against 1,000. Maslama has taken the bait, but he is treating the hook as an invasion. He is dedicating half his cavalry to destroy Elias and eliminate the threat of a relieving army. The sight was overwhelming. The Arab heavy cavalry, known for their powerful horses and curved scimitars, were moving with frightening speed. Elias's Ironsides, for all their discipline and superior armor, were now dangerously exposed on the open ground, running directly toward a trap that outnumbered them 10-1. 5 miles to the east, Brother Elias looked back and saw the terrifying spectacle. A dust cloud that dwarfed his own, a massive wave of humanity pursuing his small company. He had expected pursuit. He had expected a difficult engagement. He had not expected the full wrath of the Umayyad cavalry reserves.
Maslama had fallen for the diversion, but he intended to make the destruction of the flank a swift and absolute certainty. Elias reined in Ares, bringing his entire 1,000-man company to a halt on a low rocky ridge, the agreed-upon point of engagement. The Ironsides immediately formed a tight, three-tiered line, their lances dropped to receive the charge, their formations disciplined and deadly. They had seconds before the enemy reached them. Elias turned to his first centurion, his face now a mask of fierce, almost ecstatic resolve. They expected us to panic and retreat. They have come to crush us swiftly. But we are the Ironsides. We are the shield of the Empire. We do not break. He drew his heavy, cross-hilted sword. It was a weapon not for skirmishing, but for cleaving armor and ending battles. The morning sun glinted off the polished metal. He lifted the sword high, signaling his desperate intent to engage. "Remember Constantinople! Charge!" Elias roared the command, not of retreat, but of total commitment. The 1,000 Ironsides reversed their line and began a furious counter-charge, a small, dark thunderbolt aimed directly at the heart of the onrushing Arab wave. Back at Akroinon, Alexios watched the collision through his spyglass. He saw the two forces meet, a terrible, concentrated violence erupting on the distant plain, obscured almost immediately by a massive plume of dust and the carnage of steel. The fate of the fortress, the fate of the emperor's needed 10 days, and the lives of 1,000 brave, reckless men now rested entirely on the desperate ferocity of brother Elias. The counter-gamble had begun.
The collision was less the clash of two armies and more the meeting of a hammer and an anvil. When brother Elias led his 1,000 Ironsides in their desperate countercharge against the wave of 10,000 Umayyad horsemen, the ground itself seemed to protest with a sound that was both a thunderous roar and a wet, sickening crunch. Elias's plan was simple and suicidal. Use the superior discipline and heavy armor of the Ironsides to shatter the Arab vanguard, creating instant chaos, and then refuse to be pinned down. Their lances, longer and heavier than the standard Arab spears, struck first, punching through the lighter ringmail of the Umayyad skirmishers, instantly dropping the first few hundred riders and creating a momentary, terrifying gap in the enemy line. The Ironsides' wedge plunged deep into the opening, a concentrated battering ram of iron and disciplined fury. They did not slow down to fight individual duels. Their objective was not to kill every man, but to tear the coherence out of the massive Arab formation. Elias, fighting with the sublime, controlled rage of a man embracing his destiny, was at the forefront. His sword moved in a brutal, economic rhythm, striking only at the joints of armor and the soft necks of horses. But the Ironsides were only 1,000. The overwhelming mass of the Arab cavalry, initially stunned by the ferocity of the charge, quickly recovered and flowed around the wedge like water around a rock. They were surrounded within minutes. The air turned into a chaotic vortex of dust, screaming horses, and the ceaseless clank and shing of steel. Arab scimitars hacked at the exposed flanks and legs of the Ironsides' horses, attempting to bring the heavy riders down into the slaughter. "First centurion, break east," Elias roared, his voice hoarse. "Do not stand still. If we rout, we die. We ride. Take the high ground near the outcrop." He used his cavalry not as a defensive shield, but as a striking weapon. For the next 3 hours, in a spectacular and bloody display of horsemanship, Elias led his remaining men in a series of punishing, circular charges.
They would smash into a concentration of Arab forces, inflict maximum damage, and then retreat at speed, forcing the superior enemy to constantly chase, reform, and react. This was the key to the counter-gamble. Maslama's commanders had come for a swift, overwhelming victory, expecting the Byzantine flank to shatter or surrender. Instead, they were facing a disciplined, heavily armored force that refused to lose cohesion, drawing them further and further away from Akroinon. But the price was terrible. The Ironsides were losing men rapidly. The field was littered with the fallen, heavy, immovable forms of men and horses who had paid the ultimate price for the Emperor's 10 days. The lances were broken, replaced by heavy swords. The Ironsides were now fighting back to back, exhaustion setting in, their lungs burning from the dust and their adrenaline. Elias himself was fighting on his third horse, Ares having fallen under a barrage of arrows. His side wound, sustained the previous night, had reopened, soaking his tunic and mail in hot, dark blood. Yet he fought with a clarity he had never possessed before. The reckless zeal of Chapter 5 was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. He was no longer fighting for glory, but for tactical survival and the success of Alexios's larger, desperate plan. He saw the Arab commander of the heavy cavalry, a chieftain named al-Malik, attempting to rally his weary troops for a final enveloping charge. Al-Malik was frustrated, his disciplined lines shredded by Elias's unpredictable maneuvers. He had lost far too many men and too much time chasing a force he should have crushed instantly. Seeing his opportunity, Elias gathered the approximately 500 Ironsides who remained. They were battered, bloody, and running on sheer willpower. "Final charge," Elias screamed, spitting blood onto the dust. "We break their command. For Constantinople!" The remaining Ironsides, now a desperate, tight core, committed their final strength. They charged directly at the rallying point, bypassing the bulk of the Umayyad infantry and hitting al-Malik and his personal guard like a thunderclap. Elias, fueled by his last reserves of strength, fought his way to al-Malik and with a terrifying two-handed swing struck him from his horse. The death of al-Malik was the tipping point. The surrounding Arab forces, leaderless and shocked, momentarily broke their discipline, looking for direction where none existed. They were spent, disorganized, and miles away from their main camp. Elias, looking at his shattered company, recognized the true victory. They had not annihilated the Arab cavalry, but they had effectively neutralized them. The remaining Umayyad forces were now too scattered and too decimated to quickly reorganize and ride back to Maslama in time to counter the sabotage team or aid the main assault. He sounded the retreat on a tarnished battle horn, a weary three-note call that carried over the battlefield. The 400 surviving Ironsides disengaged, cutting their way through the fringes of the broken Arab lines. They rode back towards Akroinon, not with the high spirits of a victorious army, but in the silence of survivors. When Elias finally reined in his horse on a distant ridge and looked back, the eastern plain was a ruin of scattered bodies and exhausted, broken enemy riders. He had achieved the impossible. The counterattack maneuver had succeeded. But at what cost? He looked at the few hundred grim, exhausted faces around him. The 500 men who had died lay behind them, a glorious, bloody sacrifice. Elias was no longer the arrogant zealot. He was a scarred leader, humbled by the immense price of victory. He carried Maslama's own shredded banner, a bloody trophy of the day's work. But the weight of the lost men settled on his shoulders like a shroud. He rode towards the faint, reassuring outline of Akroinon, his mission complete, his soul forever changed.
Theophanes, the imperial scribe, was held in the deepest, most secure cistern chamber, a small, windowless space meant for long-term storage of irreplaceable scrolls, now serving as an improvised prison. He sat placidly on an overturned bucket, his hands bound by a thin, strong cord, betraying none of the terror that had consumed the rest of the garrison. Alexios and Cassia entered the room, accompanied by 2 silent Ironsides guards. The air was cool and smelled of parchment and aged rock. Theophanes, a man built for quiet scholarship rather than treason, looked up at Alexios with an expression of weary disappointment, not fear. "I confess, Commander, I always thought your end would be more glorious," Theophanes said, his voice mild and professorial. "A spectacular charge, perhaps, or a blaze of Greek fire. Not this slow, calculated destruction." Alexios did not react to the provocation. He stood tall, fully armored, a cold mountain of duty facing a brittle intellectual opponent. "Why, Theophanes? 15 years of service, 15 years of shared hardship. Why abandon your people and the city?" The scribe sighed, adjusting his spectacles. 15 years is precisely the answer, Alexios. I have seen the cycles repeat. I have logged the reports of countless defeats, watched brave men bleed out on the plain, all for a distant emperor who demands impossible sacrifices. I saw the numbers. 20,000 men. A manjaniq that can breach the walls in 48 hours. Your orders were suicidal. My loyalty is to the preservation of Christian life, not the glory of a doomed city. He paused, leaning forward conspiratorially. Maslama offered terms, a swift capitulation and no slaughter. Life for intelligence. You would have died a martyr for 10 days. I choose to live a pragmatist for peace. The empire needed a realistic timetable, not a pointless bloody delay. Cassia stepped forward, placing the violet-stained leather scrap near his feet. Pragmatism requires accuracy, scribe. You compromised our defenses and Elias's counter-gamble. Your realism has cost 500 lives on the plain. A necessary loss to confirm the betrayal, Alexios stated, his voice like grinding stone. Maslama already knew of the flanking maneuver from your earlier reports. You delayed the final message, but he still knew the threat was coming. He committed 10,000 men to destroy 1,000. It was an ambush that Elias walked into. Theophanes smiled faintly, a small scholarly triumph. Maslama would never commit such overwhelming force to a mere diversion unless he was certain it was the only diversion. My information was precise. The plan hinges on Elias drawing the cavalry away so a small team can destroy the trebuchet. My last unsent message was meant to be sent immediately after the failed night assault. Alexios's mind raced. The lantern flashes would be easily mistaken for the flickering light of men moving on the ramparts during a siege. Cassia had been looking for writing, for messengers, when the betrayal was being transmitted by light. You knew the danger to your own people, Alexios pressed, ignoring the cold sweat that broke out on his brow at the simple brilliance of the signaling. Maslama's siege engine is too fast. Even with Elias buying time, the northern wall will fall before the Emperor's reinforcements arrive. Tell me the weakness, Theophanes. What is Maslama's final contingency? The scribe tilted his head, his amusement fading into a deep, cold malice. You ask me to betray the man who spared my life? No. My debt is paid. Akroinon has 2 days remaining. You will fight bravely, Commander, but you will lose and the city will fall. Alexios knew he could not waste another second on a man who had already chosen his fate. The scribe had confirmed the method, confirming the urgency of Cassia's earlier deduction. The sabotage team was the only hope. Take him, Alexios ordered the guards, his voice devoid of emotion. Keep him here. If this fortress falls, he will answer to the Caliph. If we hold, he will answer to the Emperor. As the guards secured the door, Alexios turned to Cassia. Her face was set in a mask of grim necessity. He held back the final key, but we know enough. The treason is neutralized. Elias has bought us the time, at least 30 hours until the Arab cavalry can return to the main camp. The sabotage team has that window. We must focus entirely on the 6 men beneath the trebuchet's shadow. The counter-gamble, Alexios said, looking up toward the distant, faint sound of the great trebuchet reloading for its next shot. It now rests on 6 lives, Cassia. 6 small lives against a machine of war. He gathered his battle plans, feeling the weight of the empire settle back onto his shoulders. The scribe's fear was a rational, cold calculation. Alexios's response had to be an irrational, blazing act of faith in the 6 men now crawling across the dark plain.
The reprieve bought by Elias's suicidal charge was not peace. It was merely a pause in the destruction. All through the morning and into the early afternoon, the great trebuchet continued its terrible, rhythmic work. Crack! A massive stone launched. A moment of silence. Boom! The earth-shattering impact against the northern wall. The Ironsides, exhausted from the night fight and the emotional toll of the cavalry's sacrifice, moved like automatons to shore up the collapsing section. They hauled timber, piled heavy bags of sand and rubble, and prayed. But their work was futile. The manjaniq al-kabir was a machine of cold, efficient physics, hitting the same structural weakness again and again. The breach point was now a massive, concave wound in the fortress's strongest defense. On the command tower, Alexios stood with Cassia. He watched the massive clock, measuring the time bought by Elias, 25 hours remaining until the Arab cavalry reserves could possibly return, but also the precious, dwindling time remaining on the wall. The defense was now a race to see which failed first, the 6 men on the plain or the 2-meter-thick stone of the fortress. "The internal core is failing," Cassia said, her voice strained as the next trebuchet shot struck with a sickening grinding sound. Dust and fine stone chips showered them. "The masonry is turning to powder. It can only withstand 1, perhaps 2 more direct impacts before the entire section collapses inward." Alexios's gaze was fixed on the treacherous plain. The sabotage team had been gone for 12 hours. They were led by a young centurion named Lysander, a quiet, skilled sapper who possessed an engineer's understanding of both construction and destruction. Their mission was simple: reach the trebuchet, pack their volatile Greek fire components into the counterweight box, and set an agonizingly slow fuse. Suddenly, the Umayyad camp, which had remained largely static, save for the trebuchet crew, erupted. Thousands of Arab infantry, heavy spearmen and archers, rose from their tents and began forming dense, rectangular blocks. They moved with a chilling, disciplined purpose, heading straight for the northern wall, positioning themselves to exploit the inevitable. "Maslama sees the end," Alexios whispered. "He is preparing the final wave. He will not risk another shot striking his own men during the rush. He will fire the next one, and then he will send them through the gap." The signal from the Arab command tent was given. The trebuchet crew, 100 grim, sweating men, bent to their task, straining on the ropes. The giant arm was cranked down one last time, loading the final, most important stone. Alexios gripped the cold stone of the parapet, his mind snapping into the terrible clarity of the final defensive plan. He turned to his remaining centurions. "Every man not required to fight evacuate the northern sector. We will defend the breach with the remaining 3 companies. Centurion Demetrius, take the 2 remaining charges of Greek fire to the breach's edges. They are to be used only as a last resort, to block the gap itself, not the men. The fire must funnel them." He looked at Cassia. "Your eyes are better than mine. Watch for Lysander. We need the signal." The final shot was fired. The colossal arm snapped upward.
the huge boulder arcing through the sky with a low whistling sound that seemed to slice the silence of the waiting armies. The impact was beyond anything that had come before. It was a roar that seemed to tear the very fabric of the air. The damaged section of the wall, already compromised to its core, simply ceased to exist. The outer stone facing, the inner rubble fill, and the wooden bracing all collapsed in a spectacular plume of gray and white smoke. The sound of the collapse, a long, rolling thunder of falling masonry, was the sound of Akroinon's defeat. When the dust began to clear, a massive, jagged hole, easily 15 feet wide, gaped in the northern curtain wall. The path to the inner courtyard, the vital strategic heart of the fortress, was now exposed. The Arab forces reacted instantly. A tremendous cheer, a raw, triumphant roar of 20,000 voices erupted from the enemy lines. Maslama, seated on his horse, raised his curved scimitar, and the heavy infantry blocks began their relentless, deadly march towards the breach. The final assault had begun. Alexios did not wait for the dust to settle. He drew his own sword, the polished Byzantine steel reflecting the terror in the sky. He had foreseen this moment, and his remaining men, 2,000 Ironsides and the terrified but now obedient auxiliaries, were already running to form a tight, unyielding shield wall at the base of the collapsed gap. "Stand fast," Alexios bellowed, charging towards the breach, taking his place at the center of the defensive line. "They take the wall, but they will not take the city. For the Emperor, for Christ." Just as the first Arab soldiers, screaming with victory, rushed into the shadow of the broken wall, Cassia let out a strangled cry from the tower. "Alexios, look! The trebuchet!" Cassia pointed frantically toward the Arab camp. Deep within the shadow of the manjaniq al-kabir, a tiny, flickering light, a fire, had suddenly flared up. It was followed seconds later by a prearranged signal flash, a quick sequence of 3 bursts of light, the sign that the sabotage team had completed their task and ignited the fuse. Lysander and his 5 men had succeeded. But the success was too late. The fuse was designed to burn slowly to give the men time to escape. It was not meant to stop the attack already underway. The Arabs were already in the breach, and the massive trebuchet still stood, ready to be defended by 10,000 enemy infantry. Alexios saw the signal. Hope flared in his chest, instantly tempered by the terrifying immediate reality. The wall was broken, the enemy was in the fortress, and the fate of the Empire rested on a slow-burning fuse half a mile away. The final battle was here.
The moment the northern wall became a gaping, jagged hole, the battle ceased to be a siege and became a terrifying, brutal brawl. The lead elements of the Umayyad infantry, hardened spearmen and armored shock troops, flooded into the 15-foot breach, screaming their battle cries, convinced the fortress was theirs. They met a wall of absolute iron. Alexios, standing shoulder to shoulder with his Ironsides, anchored the center of the shield wall. The fighting was immediate, visceral, and focused entirely on the narrow gap. The Byzantine defenders, though outnumbered by more than 5 to 1, held the advantage of position. The broken masonry funneled the Arab advance, turning the sheer weight of their numbers into a bottleneck of crushing humanity. Alexios fought with a cold, desperate efficiency, using his shield to deflect blows and his short, heavy sword to strike quick, decisive cuts. Every man in the line knew the stakes. If the shield wall wavered for a single second, the Arab flood would pour into the courtyard, and the 5-day ration of life Elias had bought them would be forfeit. The Arab pressure was relentless. They climbed over the bodies of their own dead, determined to break the line. Alexios roared commands, his voice hoarse, pushing the edge of the shield wall forward an inch at a time, creating a meat grinder in the gap. "Demetrius, now, deploy the charges.
Alexios yelled over the din of battle. Centurion Demetrius, positioned on the rubble mound just to the left of the breach, executed the final, devastating phase of Alexios's trap. He had the 2 remaining barrels of Greek fire mixture, the last reserve of the Empire's secret weapon. He ordered the barrels tipped, and the volatile, sticky fluid, the liquid fire, poured down the slopes of the broken wall, concentrating heavily along the flanks of the breach. Then, with 2 carefully thrown torches, the 2 edges of the massive gap erupted in a terrifying, unquenchable blaze. The fire was the general's trap. It didn't harm the men fighting in the middle of the shield wall, but it instantly blocked and incinerated the Arab reinforcements attempting to flank or surge into the gap. The 2 wings of fire turned the breach into a searing, deadly funnel, ensuring that only a few men could fight the Ironsides at a time, neutralizing Maslama's numerical superiority. The screams that rose from the flanks of the breach were chilling. The fire, fed by its chemical composition, burned with an unnatural, furious heat. The Arab advance stalled instantly, their formations breaking as men desperately tried to escape the impossible flames. For a brief, agonizing minute, the fighting in the breach became a stalemate, the Ironsides holding the center line, the Arabs trapped between the Byzantine steel and the merciless chemical fire. Maslama, observing the chaos from his command ridge, realized his mistake too late. The expenditure of the last Greek fire charges meant the Byzantines were at the end of their rope, but they had traded it for a temporary, bloody victory. He looked toward the manjaniq al-kabir, waiting for the trebuchet coup to load the next stone and finish the job. But the trebuchet would not fire again. High in the enormous counterweight box of the siege engine, the slow-burning fuse ignited the highly explosive mixture of Greek fire components Lysander's team had planted. The explosion was not the thunder of a falling stone. It was a tearing, rending throom, a violent, concentrated detonation of chemical force. The massive wooden counterweight box, which held tons of rock, was instantly shredded, and the colossal main-throwing arm snapped in half with the force of a thunderbolt. Wood, stone, and the volatile mixture rained down in a brief, brilliant shower of fire and shrapnel over the immediate area. The great trebuchet, the symbol of Maslama's strategic confidence and the architect of Akroinon's defeat, was reduced to a smoking, useless ruin. The effect was instantaneous and profound. The deafening, triumphant roar of the Arab army, which had cheered the breach, died in their throats. They looked from the searing inferno in the wall to the burning wreck of their invincible siege engine. The weapon that guaranteed their victory was gone. Maslama, seeing the wreckage and the fire trap in the breach, recognized the cold, ruthless genius of Alexios' counter-gamble. The cost had been staggering: the loss of 10,000 cavalry tied up on the plain, the destruction of the centerpiece of his siege, and the terrible loss of life in the breach. He had been played. With a curse, Maslama signaled the immediate retreat. The Arabs still fighting in the breach, surrounded by fire and outnumbered locally, were quickly cut down or captured. The wave of the assault reversed, and the infantry blocks, broken in spirit, began to pull back from the northern wall. Alexios, leaning heavily on his shield, watched the retreat. His chest heaved, his face was streaked with blood and soot, but the fire in his eyes was one of victory. The breach was held. The great trebuchet was destroyed. Elias had succeeded in his sacrifice, and Lysander had delivered the final, decisive blow. He had disobeyed the emperor's order for a 10-day passive hold, risked the ultimate penalty for treason, and instead achieved the strategic result in less than 3 days. As the remaining Ironsides began the grim work of securing the ruined breach, Cassia rushed down from the tower and found Alexios, utterly exhausted, standing amidst the rubble. "The trebuchet is gone, Commander," she whispered, tears mixed with the grime on her face. "Maslama is retreating to the south ridge to reorganize. You have bought us the time. You have saved the city."
Alexios simply nodded, sheathing his sword. He looked toward the plains where Elias had fought his terrible, costly engagement. He had held the line, but the price of the general's trap, the lost men in the depleted fire, was a debt he would carry for the rest of his life. The siege was over, but the reckoning was still to come.
The sun was beginning its slow descent when the last of the Arab infantry units pulled back from the northern wall. Their retreat was not a rout, but a sullen, disciplined withdrawal ordered by a furious Maslama. The destruction of the great trebuchet and the realization that the Byzantine commander had sacrificed half his cavalry for a tactical advantage, a sacrifice that paid off, broke the siege's momentum. Maslama knew he could not breach the walls now without a prolonged, costly struggle that would drain his supplies and expose his army to potential Byzantine reinforcements from the north. The 10-day delay the emperor had sought was no longer a theoretical deadline. It was a military necessity that Alexios had purchased in blood. Maslama ordered his immense army to begin breaking camp, relocating to a defensive position miles to the south, contenting himself with the knowledge that he had severely weakened the garrison, drained its secret weapon, and forced the Byzantines to commit near suicide to survive. The siege was over. In Akroinon, the immediate aftermath was one of stunned, exhausted silence. The Ironsides, their armor scarred and dented, pulled bodies, both Arab and Byzantine, from the smoking ruins of the breach. The stench of burned flesh and Greek fire hung over the courtyard like a toxic shroud. Alexios, his body heavy with fatigue, found Cassia next to the breach, supervising the removal of the last of the enemy dead. The wall was ruined, but the inner courtyard was safe. "The siege is lifted," Alexios stated, the words sounding hollow. "We have held the city." "You did more than hold it, Alexios," Cassia replied, her eyes red-rimmed. "You won. Maslama is moving his camp. We have days, perhaps a week, to repair the breach before he considers a return." The silence was broken by a distant, rhythmic sound, the weary, dull thud of hooves on dry earth. It was Elias. His company rode into the fortress through the western gate, the same gate he had defended with furious zeal the night before. But the 1,000 magnificent riders who had thundered out at dawn were gone. They were replaced by a grim, ragged procession of just over 400 men. Their armor was shredded, their faces were masked in dust and blood, and they moved with the slow, terrible grace of survivors. Elias was at the head, swaying slightly in the saddle, clutching a limp, blood-soaked cloth, Maslama's banner. He looked less like the arrogant, zealous captain and more like a ghost. He dismounted, ignoring the helping hands, and stumbled toward Alexios. "We drew them, Commander," he grated out, his voice a low rasp. "We killed their leaders. They are broken and scattered on the plain. But the price—" He trailed off, looking at the silent, surviving riders who followed him. The loss was a physical chasm between them. "The price was necessary," Alexios said, his voice flat. He looked Elias straight in the eye, offering no pity, only respect. "You bought us the survival of the Empire, Captain. You achieved the impossible." Then he looked past Elias at the wounded. "Cassia, begin the triage. Elias, you are relieved of duty. Report to the infirmary immediately." But Elias ignored the order. He pointed a shaking, bloodied finger toward the scriptorium where the traitor was held. "The scribe, what is his fate?" Alexios glanced at the scriptorium. "He is secured. He will answer to the emperor. For now, he is useful as a political asset. Our immediate problem is here." The general turned his attention back to the massive, smoking breach in the northern wall. The cost of victory was starkly visible. Over 600 Ironsides dead or gravely wounded, the entire Greek fire reserve consumed, and a massive breach in the primary defense. The fortress was critically vulnerable. "Cassia, begin rationing the water to its absolute minimum," Alexios commanded, his mind already calculating the next moves. "Find Centurion Lysander. His team must be located and tended to. And for the next 24 hours, the entire garrison will work on rebuilding the breach. Every man who can lift a stone, every man who can hold a torch. We are no longer soldiers, we are laborers. We must rebuild the wall before Maslama realizes the extent of our exhaustion." As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, casting the plain in shadow, Alexios stood amidst the rubble, watching the weary, victorious survivors begin the grim work of salvage and defense. He had won the battle, saved the fortress, and fulfilled his strategic duty to the empire, but he had done so by violating every order and sacrificing a third of his loyal men. The siege was over, but the general's reckoning, both the imperial judgment for his disobedience and the personal toll of his command, was just beginning. He had 10 days of peace, but no rest.
The next 6 days passed in a relentless, feverish blur of labor. The victorious Ironsides and the auxiliary troops, driven by the memory of the breach and the relentless will of Alexios, ceased to be soldiers and became stonemasons. They dismantled the inner rubble of the collapsed wall, hauled new stone from the quarry near the western gate, and rebuilt the northern defense, layer by agonizing layer. Cassia, supervising the distribution of the meager water rations and the construction teams, moved with the quiet efficiency of a woman who knew they were racing against a clock that was about to reset. Elias, physically recovering but spiritually broken by the sacrifice of his men, kept his word to Alexios. He did not ask for the immediate execution of Theophanes, instead throwing his energy into leading the reconstruction. He worked alongside his remaining 400 riders, hoisting beams and setting stone, their scarred bodies a testament to the terrible price of their victory. The shared labor, more than any speech, began the slow process of healing the division in the ranks. On the dawn of the 7th day, the watchman's horn sounded, signaling not the return of the Arab threat, but the arrival of the long-awaited Byzantine reinforcements. A small, heavily armed detachment of Imperial cavalry crested the northern ridge. They were not a fighting army, but an elite escort for a single, commanding figure, General Kinigos, the Emperor's chief military envoy. The 10 days the Emperor had ordered had almost elapsed, and the aid had arrived, 3 days late. Kinigos, an imposing man in immaculate, polished armor, rode into Akroinon's courtyard, his eyes taking in the evidence of the recent siege, the charred western gate, the smoking pile of Arab wreckage near the northern perimeter, and the massive, fresh-mortared section of the rebuilt wall. He saw the garrison, tired, dirty, and half its original size, but alive. Alexios stood before the envoy, his armor grimy, his face showing the exhaustion of a man who had not slept soundly in a week. He offered a crisp, formal salute. "General Kinigos, welcome to Akroinon. The city is secured. The Arab army, commanded by Maslama, has retreated south after a major engagement." Kinigos returned the salute, his expression unreadable. "My reports indicate the army arrived on the first day, Commander. The Emperor's instruction was clear: hold the fortress passively for 10 days. Yet the evidence suggests a massive, unscheduled battle, the destruction of a major siege engine, and the use of the entire Greek fire reserve, and the loss of over 600 of the Emperor's elite cavalry." Kinigos paused, looking directly into Alexios' eyes. "Did you follow the Emperor's orders, Alexios?" "I fulfilled the Emperor's strategic objective, General. The order to hold was based on the belief that Akroinon would withstand a prolonged siege. The Arab siege engine, the manjaniq al-kabir, was capable of breaching the walls in less than 3 days. To obey the letter of the order would have meant the fortress's annihilation before your arrival. I chose to save the Empire's objective by sacrificing my own authority." He then gestured to Theophanes' locked cell. "The siege was aided by a traitor, the Imperial scribe, who was relaying our vulnerabilities. I neutralized the threat, used a diversionary attack to draw the enemy's main cavalry away, and destroyed their weapon. Akroinon remains in Byzantine hands, and Maslama's timetable is now shattered. We have bought the Emperor not 10 days of waiting, but 10 days of unchallenged control over the region." Kinigos listened in silence. He did not look at the ruined wall or the weary men, he looked only at Alexios. The general understood the brutal logic of the choice. Alexios had risked everything to succeed where a passive defense would certainly have failed. "Your courage is noted, General. I present you with a sealed imperial document. However, disobedience is disobedience. You engaged the enemy, violated the explicit orders of the Emperor, and destroyed irreplaceable imperial assets. By order of the Emperor, you are hereby relieved of your command of Akroinon, effective immediately. You will place yourself under arrest and return with me to Constantinople to face judgment." The resolution was both expected and crushing. Alexios had saved the city, but he would pay for it with his career, perhaps his life. "I accept the Emperor's judgment," Alexios said quietly. He removed his commander's cloak and handed it to Kinigos. "General, I recommend Captain Elias be given temporary command of the garrison. He is exhausted, but his loyalty is now absolute, and he understands the cost of holding this city." Alexios gave his final orders to Cassia, to continue the water rationing and the wall repairs. He then turned to Elias, who stood nearby, watching the scene with grim understanding. "I will see you in Constantinople, brother captain." Elias, who had once despised Alexios' pragmatism, now saw the terrible purity of his sacrifice. He simply nodded, offering the deep, quiet respect of one warrior to another. Alexios walked towards Kinigos' waiting escort, leaving the fortress he had saved. As he stepped out onto the plain, now quiet and empty of the vast enemy host, he looked back one last time at the scarred, rebuilt wall. He had gambled the lives of his men and his own fate for the survival of the Empire. The cost was high, the judgment harsh, but as the Imperial escort rode north, Alexios knew that he had made the only choice a true general could make. The city was safe, and the cost of the Empire had been paid in full.